I'm Ashraf Hayat, Executive Director of the Institute. Thank you all for attending, and especially the honored speakers, Dr. Hafiz Pasha, Senator Harun Akhtar Khan, and the distinguished Tim Jones. You honor us with your time, gentlemen. We start with a short recitation from the Holy Quran. Mr. Yunus Bengali is one of the participants, and I request him to recite a selection. Yunus is a chartered accountant, a businessman, and more importantly, one of the noble spirits behind the Indus Hospital Network and the Patient Aid Foundation. You have the mic, Yunus.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ar-Rahman wallama al-Quran. خلق الإنسان علمه البيان. الرحمن علم القرآن. خلق الإنسان علمه البيان. الشمس والقمر بحسبان. والنجم والشجر يسجدان. والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان. ألا تطغوا في الميزان. وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان. والأرض وضعها للأنام. فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام. والحب ذو العصف والريحان. فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان. صدق الله العظيم. The translation is, in the name of the beneficent Allah, who taught the Quran. He created man, taught him the mode of expression. The sun, the moon follow a reckoning, and the plants and trees prostrate to him. And the heaven, he raised it high, and he made the balance, that you may not be inordinate in respect of the measure. Keep up the balance, and do not make the measure deficient. And the earth he has set for living beings. Therein is fruit and palms in clusters, and the grain with husks and fragrance. Which then of the bounties of your Lord will you deny? Sadaqallahu al-Azim.
Thank you, Yunus. And Jazakallah, that was very appropriate. And thank you for taking the time, as well as much appreciation for the stellar work of the two foundations that you are associated with. We look forward to an informed discussion on the economic crisis faced by the country, severe even for an economy that is used to instability. Most of us want to know how it will affect our lives and how such repeated crises that sets the country back by years could be averted in the future. And if the only way out of our troubles is to take on more debt. The accompanying political instability and a charged social environment make this situation even more demanding. The rest of this meeting would proceed as follows. We start with introductory comments by Mr. Humayun Akhtar Khan, after which the three panelists will speak. The meeting then opens for questions and comments, after which we return to the three panelists for their response. I will take the liberty of requesting the speakers to take note of questions that they wish to respond to. We begin with introductory comments from Mr. Humayun Akhtar Khan. Humayun Saab has been in public service for over 30 years. In 4 general elections, he was elected a member of the National Assembly, during which period he also held cabinet positions as Pakistan's Commerce Minister and Chairman BOI. Among his many interests, Mr. Khan is also CEO and chairperson of this institute. And as I've said in past events, but it bears repeating, a source of inspiration for all of us who work here. Establishing this institute is one demonstration of his commitment to the country by helping make public policy work for all. I request Humayun Saab to introduce today's topic. You have the mic, sir.
Thank you, Ashraf Saab. I wish to thank the very illustrious speakers, and I'm so happy that they have found the time to participate. Dr. Hafiz Pasha, who I call my teacher and my mentor in my public life. Mr. Harun Khan, who is a businessman in Pakistan and also has held public appointments. He was the Minister for Revenue, and we are so happy that Mr. Tim Jones of Jubilee Debt Campaign could participate. It's very kind of him. And of course, I wish to thank all our very illustrious participants who make this webinar what it is. And we're very grateful. This discussion today is meant to get a better understanding of why the country's economy is in repeated crisis. We want to spend the next hour and a half, couple of hours on that. And I basically have three questions. How bad is the current economic crisis? Number one. What can be done to prevent such crises from happening so frequently? And number three, how can the coming budget address some of the issues that the country faces? These are the three fundamental questions that we put on the table today. I will lay the groundwork for today's discussion and put some facts before everyone. As you can see, the share of productive sector in the economies, GDP, has been in decline for many years. So in the last 20 years, growth has largely not occurred from production of goods, that is agriculture and manufactured goods. As a matter of fact, in many growing economies, the agriculture sector usually shrinks as a percentage of GDP, but that's usually accompanied by the manufactured goods sector increasing as a percentage of GDP. In Pakistan, both have shrunk. So that's probably a unique phenomenon. And the reason is not hard to see. As we see, savings and investment both have fallen continuously. Also, the credit to private sector has declined. As investment and private credit fell, exports also took a hit. And you'll see that in 1990, Pakistan's export were 19% of GDP. In 2000, it stood at 15% of GDP, peaking at 17% in 2005. In 2021, export to GDP ratio was a low 8.5%. And that, to a large extent, explains our current account challenges. Also, GDP growth has been volatile, as the graph indicates. While the high growth points are for 1 or 2 years, the low and moderate periods are prolonged. And those high points have occurred in the years when Pakistan received large amounts of foreign aid. Our economic structure is such that the economy is stable if GDP grows by 2 to 3%. The reason is we have not invested in enhancing productive capacity and exports. So when growth rate increases to about 5%, or there is an international commodity prices which affects the imports of Pakistan, like the situation in COVID, and now exacerbated by the situation as a result of Ukraine, the current account shoots up and an economic crisis occurs, leading to lengthy periods of low or moderate growth. And one major reason why private investment has fallen is that government uses up a lot of available credit to meet the financial gap caused by the budget deficit. For the last 30 years, the budget deficit has been consistently high at an average of about 6% of GDP. To meet that deficit, government borrows, which crowds out private credit. But the remarkable point in Pakistan to note is that while budget deficit has stayed high throughout the 30 years, public investment represented by the Public Sector Development Program has fallen consistently, as can be seen from the trend line in the chart on the screen. Public investment too is an enabler of private investment, as it provides the public goods, the physical infrastructure, and better human resources to raise private sector productivity. And therefore, a reduction in the Public Sector Development Program has also led to a lower private investment. Now, if there is less money for public investment, where is the money going? Let me elaborate on that. In fiscal year 21, 38% of total federal expenditure went to payment of interest on domestic and foreign debt. 19% for subsidies. And these subsidies include payment for tariff differential subsidy for electricity and to loss-making public sector enterprises. There are many other uses to which it is put, though I have not included the social safety net that exists in Pakistan, which is the Asas and the BISP program. So let's take a minute to dwell on the logic of public finance in Pakistan. We use 78% of net federal revenue, which is equal to 38% of total federal expenditure, for interest payment. And then government borrows more money to pay for its expenditure, which further adds to subsequent interest payments. And as the current, which is suspended right now, IMF program stipulates that the primary deficit must stay positive. So what do? So each year, government spends more and more funds to meet interest expenditure while restricting most other expense. Now, this has had an effect on the external account. Looking at the same matter from the external account perspective, structure of our economy has become such that we meet more and more of the economy's needs from imports. Thus, Pakistan's current account is almost always in deficit, as you can see in the upper left chart. Because exports are not growing, dollars for imports come from imported capital, and that is from external debt. Resultantly, external debt and debt servicing, principal and interest payments have grown, which you can see in the upper right chart. We have paid more and more in external debt servicing. But interestingly, the stock, which is the olive line in the chart, has kept growing. So while we pay more and more, our debt is still increasing. And the rupee keeps losing value, which means that Pakistanis are becoming poorer and all imports cost more. So, in my view, the economy is caught in a trap of low investment, low productivity, low exports, and high debt and debt servicing. Let me move on to see what's happening to our debt profile. So as we borrow more for imports and debt servicing, we must access debt from high-cost sources, such as bonds and sukuks, while the share of concessional debt has fallen. And let me give you some very interesting statistics as the chart shows. The Paris Club debt from 25.1% of GDP has gone down to 8.8%. The multilateral debt from 42.7% of GDP in 2010 has come down to 27.6%. And on the other hand, let's look at the expensive debt. The bonds, the Euro bonds and Sukuk was 2.7% in 2010 of GDP, now it's 6.4%. The commercial loans, including loans to public sector enterprises, was 0 in 2010, is now 8.4%. And the government forex liabilities were 2% in 2010, it's 7.2% right now. And it should not be surprising, therefore, that all debt sustainability indicators have worsened. Let me tell you in the chart that appears, the total external debt to GDP was 31.8% in 2010, it's 40.6% now. The total external debt to exports was 183%. In 2010, it's 384% now. So this, in short, is the story of Pakistan's economic travails. The purpose of my discussion is to lay before you some key facts and challenges that our economy faces. And I'll end my discussion here. As I said, I look forward to the very eminent group of speakers to share with us their views about the economy, and I look forward to their comments. Thank you. Over to you, Ashraf Saab.
Thank you, sir. That was a very fine capsule of the state of play of the economy. Your discussion added several layers of analysis to the widely held views about the challenges and possibilities that the country is faced with. By the way, this meeting is also being live streamed on IPR's Facebook page. We move to the first eminent speaker on our panel. It gives me special pleasure to welcome Dr. Hafiz Pasha, a leading economist and academic, who has also held several key cabinet positions, including finance, commerce, education, and he was Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission. He was also UN Assistant Secretary General and UNDP's Assistant Administrator and Director Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific. My personal association with Dr. Saab was shorter than I would have liked, but he's left a deep impression. And as Humayun Saab said too, that he acted a mentor, a guide, and a teacher. He has the great ability for connecting dots to form patterns and portraits that enrich our understanding of seemingly unconnected events. In his remarkable career, Dr. Pasha has a long list of achievements, but in my view, none more than setting up the Applied Economic Research Center and lead of UNDP's Pakistan National Human Development Report 2020, a document that many of us refer to often. And if not many people have seen it, please do take time to take a look at it. It's on the UNDP website. We're happy that he has spared time to be here. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Hafiz Pasha to the virtual podium. Dr. Pasha, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. Let me start by saying that it is indeed a welcome opportunity to be part of a very, very important event organized by the IPR. And let me start by thanking the chairman, Mr. Humayun Akhtar Khan, and to Ashraf Hayat Saab for having organized this event. And let me also start by saying that Humayun Akhtar Khan Saab made an excellent introductory statement, and that has made life somewhat simpler for us, all of us. So thank you for this very, very useful upfront guiding statement. Let me start by saying that the title is very appropriate. Is the economy in a free fall? Now, since we are focusing on budgetary issues, I would try and indicate to you how our economy is in a free fall as far as the budgetary situation is concerned. The first thing to note is that if you take the new GDP estimates, which have come with the new base year of 2015-16, believe it or not, Pakistan's entire tax to GDP ratio combined of the federal and provincial governments is hardly it is about 6,500 billion. It is about 10% maximum of the GDP. And there was a time in our history when Pakistan had approached 13 to 14% of the GDP. And when you compare our performance now, unfortunately, we are almost half the tax to GDP ratio of India. And this is really very, very unfortunate. And in a way, this is the beginnings of the root of the financial problem that this country faces. Over the last 5 years, in fact, the tax to GDP ratio has fallen by something like 3 percentage points, which is a very sizable drop. Instead of going up, it has fallen. The other problem, of course, is the fact that, as highlighted by the chairman, Pakistan's current expenditure has grown out of proportions. Do you know that today, Pakistan, the government sector is 1/6 of the economy? This is the size of the government sector. This is huge. There appear to be no economies of scale in our operations. The share has gone up. And one of the principal reasons that has been highlighted by the chairman, of course, is the rising debt to GDP ratio, which has crossed 5 to 5.5% of the GDP by itself. You know, it's fascinating. If you look at the last 20 years and compare the 3 Ds, the 3 principal expenditures, D1 is debt servicing, D2 is development, and D3 is defense. Way back at the start of this century, the number 1 item was development, followed by defense, and then debt servicing. Now you have exactly the opposite situation. You have debt servicing right up there, then followed by defense, and finally development spending has shrunk grossly over the last few years. This is the reason why Pakistan's productive capacity in terms of investment in infrastructure is rightly highlighted. I mean, it is indeed tragic that Pakistan's investment in water resources remains very limited, and our investment in the power distribution system otherwise also is very low and has in fact declined. So there has been a kind of a change in the pattern of current spending and development spending, which has led to restricted growth. I mean, imagine there was a time in the earlier part of the century when our development spending used to be 5 to 5.5% of the GDP. Now we are lucky if we can close a year with 2 to 2.5% of the GDP. This is the tragedy. And let me now then come to the bottom line. What's been happening to our fiscal budgetary deficit? We reached an all-time peak in 2018-19 when our budget deficit peaked at 8.9% of the GDP. The chairman has said that the long-term average is about 6% of the GDP, but in the last 3-4 years, we have seen it go significantly above that. The first year this happened was 2017-18, the last year of the Muslim League government, when it approached 6.6, then it went up to 8.9. And this year, believe it or not, we are going to set a new record. We are very good at setting records into exactly the wrong things. Our budget deficit is going to be close to 9% of the GDP, believe it or not. And we started this year with a great deal of optimism that Pakistan would finally cut down its fiscal deficit and bring it down to 6.3% of the GDP. Instead, we'll be fortunate if we can close it this year at 9% of the GDP. This is the highest fiscal deficit. So you can see the free fall. The free fall is visible in the escalating fiscal deficit, which has led to big growth in our debt. And what has happened is that occasionally we raise the GDP so that we can artificially bring down the debt to GDP ratio. In real terms, our debt has been growing very fast. And today, believe it or not, each person in our country has a debt on his or her head of 200,000 rupees. The per capita public debt is 200,000 rupees. At the start of the century, it was hardly 50 to 60,000. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me say that Pakistan is very much in the free fall situation. And let me very quickly now turn to what we can expect next year. During the negotiations with the International Monetary Fund for the 6th review by the previous government, there was an understanding reached on what should be the targets for the next fiscal year, 2022-23. And the understanding was that Pakistan would somehow or the other manage to stay within the limit imposed by the budget, which is 6.3% of the GDP this year. Nobody had anticipated late last year that the deficit would rise to 9%. But Pakistan has committed to the International Monetary Fund to limit the deficit next year to 4.5% of the GDP. This is unbelievable because this will require something like 100%, halving the deficit from 9 to 4.5%. And is that likely to happen? I'm afraid there are indications that the free fall will continue and the fund will walk away because of that. Why will that happen? The first reason is our revenues next year will be depressed by two particular factors which were favorable this year. First, petroleum levy is out. We lose 500 billion almost because of that. Second, our revenues will not include, at least initially, the sales tax on petroleum products, which is a hefty over 200 billion rupees. So the end result, you start this year with a handicap on revenues, which is close to about 400 billion rupees, or even more if you include gas infrastructure development cess and so on and so forth. Then on top of that, when you come to the current expenditure side, this year the average policy rate of the state bank has been close to 9.45%. And only recently, it was a few days ago raised to 13.75%. If this rate persists, as is likely to be the case, because we have to cut down on aggregate demand and indirectly on imports, you will begin to see next year possibly a 4 percentage points higher interest rate on domestic debt, that will add close to 1,000 billion to the debt servicing bill. This is unbelievable. But that's the way it is. You are carrying such high now policy rate that it at the margin today we are borrowing at the rates of 15 to 16. Now with this announcement of 13.75, it could even be somewhat higher. And if we do not get a net inflow of foreign external assistance or money, almost the entire budget will have to be financed by domestic borrowing, and that will only add to pressures on the market and contribute further to what the chairman referred to as the, if you like, the crowding out of the private sector from bank credit. This will be almost complete. The third factor, which is going to be very difficult for us to manage, is going to be the issue of subsidies. This year, subsidies are going to be about 600 billion higher, most of which, of course, is due to the low price we have been charging on petroleum products, which is costing us a subsidy of 100 billion rupees a month. The problem is the mushroom growth in the subsidy requirements of the power sector. 5 years ago, the power sector subsidy used to be 125 billion. This year, it could close at 600, and it will be even more if supplementary grants are given to reduce the rapid growth in circular debt. So next year, you will have a monster in terms of the subsidies, thanks to the spiraling growth in circular debt. Imagine, for example, the Chinese plants, today I'm told, they are almost $1.5 billion indebted to them in payments, in rupees, of course. This is the magnitude of the subsidy problem. So when you add up all this, you're left with absolutely no space for development spending. And the unfortunate problem with our development spending is that it's a classic case of having spread too thin, perhaps because each person in the cabinet or elsewhere in the government has a favorite project. Today, we are having over 1,050 projects being executed. And the total throw forward of costs, which is to be incurred on these projects, is over 8,000 billion. I'm talking of the federal PSDP, 8,000 billion rupees. And how much are we allocating this year? With great difficulty, we started with 900 billion at the federal PSDP size. We'll be lucky if we close at 500. So you have a throw forward, which is 16 times your annual spending. No wonder projects which should be executed in 3-4 years get executed in 10 to 12 years, and cost runs could be 2 to 3 times. Believe me, the planning process and the execution of the projects is yet another example of the economy in a free fall. Overall, what is the outlook for next year? Given the shortfall likely in revenue, given the fact that we are also going to be trying to restrain imports, you will not see the 50% growth in imports that we saw this year, which provided a bonanza to FDR revenues. We'll be lucky if we can get a growth rate of 15 to 20%. And then if we allow for the fact that the base numbers are going to be lower because of the withdrawal of the sales tax and petroleum levy, it's going to be very difficult to show significant growth. My own calculations are that Pakistan, unfortunately, due to all these factors, rising debt servicing, higher cost of state-owned enterprises, higher cost of circular debt being managed, higher cost of government administration, and let's see what is happening to defense spending. It's a matter of national security. As indicated, although not explicitly by the chairperson, 90% of our revenues net of transfers to the provinces this year are going to be used up in debt service. the end result is that hardly 10 to 15% of defense spending will be met through revenues, and the remainder 85 to 90% through borrowing. And if we continue to be in a fund program, the fund will keep saying reduce primary deficit, which is basically revenues minus expenditure excluding debt servicing, and the largest head in that category is, of course, defense. So we are cutting defense. The growth rate of defense spending has come down. Today, Pakistan's ratio with respect to India in defense spending is 8 to 1. India 8, Pakistan 1. 20 years or more ago, we used to ensure a ratio of 3 to 1. So we do not have the resources to ensure a modicum of vital national security. And this is going to become a critical issue as we go along. So let me conclude by saying that if we think we can get the deficit down below 9% next year, I only pray to Allah and hope to God that it remains at 9. There is every likelihood that it may spill over further. And meanwhile, IMF expects us to be at 4.5% of the GDP. This is a joke. And the likelihood that we will be able to complete the 8th and the 9th review of the existing program is very low. Even now, after the recent increase of 30 rupees only yesterday, we still have a subsidy on petroleum products of 50 billion rupees. Only half the subsidy has been removed. So this is the nature of the problem. And if we continue with this, another 600 billion of subsidies required next year. So let me conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by saying that the economy is truly in a free fall. In fiscal terms, we have now deficits which are way out of control, which highlight bankruptcy even at the domestic level. Fortunately, we used to have the option at one stage of printing rupees, borrowing directly from the state bank. Even that has been taken away from us by the IMF, and the State Bank Act no longer allows this. So we're going to have credit restrictions. We're going to have hopeless, if you like, shutting out of the private sector from credit. I'm sorry, I'm giving you a very depressing picture, but I want to say that my own view of the economy is consistent with the view that was taken in the title of this event, which is the economy in a free fall? My answer is yes, it is in a free fall, even in the domestic, budgetary, and financial area of federal government, particularly in Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. That was a terrific overview, although a very ominous one, and paints a picture that there are tough times ahead in the next year or two, and maybe longer, and the things to do for the economy. And now we have someone with the right combination, hands-on policy making and marketplace experience to guide us through the maze and labyrinth of issues that is holding the economy back, and perhaps also what to do about them. Senator Harun Akhtar Khan has a distinguished record of business success and public service. He was twice elected to the Senate of Pakistan. Also twice he served in the Punjab Assembly. During 2015 to 2018, he made noteworthy contributions as Minister for Revenue and Special Assistant to the Prime Minister. As Senator, Harun Saab was active on key economic committees, where as an ardent believer in parliamentary oversight, he gained high recognition for reviewing executive performance in pursuit of the goal of effective governance. Harun Saab is also on the board of this institute's board of directors. You have the virtual podium, Harun Saab.
Thank you very much, Ashraf Saab. And when you speak after Dr. Hafiz Pasha, it makes your task more challenging. I consider him perhaps the best brain in economics in this country. So I will like to touch on related topics which normally don't get discussed. And maybe at the end of my talk, I'd like to leave some light at the end of the tunnel among a lot of doom and gloom, and rightly so, that is all around us as far as the economic picture is concerned. I start by saying that a lot of other countries may have been in worse position than Pakistan today is economically, and they bounced back. In fact, all the great economic powers rose from the ruins, some after the World War and some after other debacles. And the examples in front of us are Germany, Japan, South Korea, China, Singapore, and all that. So I'd like to bring in the hope that if they could do it, we can also do that. I think one element that has been missing in our case is the lack of leadership. And I still think there's a lot of potential in our nation, and I'm sure nobody is denying that. But no potential can be used or put together unless it is led by the right person. Going ahead, I consider this problem from another point of view also. I look at my region, I compare myself, and I look at the current times. I compare myself, my country with India and Bangladesh. India exports over $600 billion. India foreign exchange reserves over $600 billion. GDP growth over 8%. Bangladesh exports over $40 billion. Foreign exchange reserves around $45 billion, growing at about over 7%. And in our case, exports will barely cross $30 billion, and reserves, as we all know, are in a dismal position, less than $10 billion if you look at the state bank reserves, and if you take away the deposits by our friendly countries, we are almost down to zero. So there is something wrong. But why is it just with us? We're about the same kind of people, same kind of economies. What happened to us, which did not happen to India and Bangladesh, if we just compare with those two economies? The sad part is that we are behind Bangladesh also. We are behind their exports. We have been for a long time, and we are behind their GDP growth also, behind their reserves. So something drastically went wrong. And I personally think, because we have limited time, so moving forward, I think you cannot pinpoint the blame on any one person. I think it's a number of mistakes, blunders after blunders and mistakes, and not realizing reality and not realizing and learning from your mistakes, which has brought us to this position. I'm not going to make any political statement here, but in the last 3.5 years, I personally think we have set a new tradition. I mean, it was there, but we pass all the blame on the previous governments. Previously, we used to do that 6 months into our term, but now we probably are used to doing it throughout the term. And we miss some very important decisions when we do not accept that the blame actually lies somewhere else. The problem arises from the current account deficit. Now, we have a trade deficit problem, which should be overcome by rising remittances and foreign investment. There has been almost no foreign investment in the last 5 years. Where has it gone? I mean, I remember in the 90s when we had load shedding problems and the government of Benazir Bhutto, she provided an incentive for IPPs, and almost the entire world came to Pakistan to set up those plants. But this time, between 2013 and 2018, when we had a severe load shedding problem, and we invited the world, only Chinese came for our help through the CPEC program. So that is one of the major reasons that our trade deficits have not been able to be overcome by our remittances and by foreign investment. We used to think that the problem is because of the era of terrorism and the terrorist acts that we faced, but we are out of that by and large. So there's something really wrong here. Why are the foreign investors not considering Pakistan for the investment? And we don't realize what is happening. You talk of the foreign investors. I think the Pakistani investors are not considering Pakistan for investing in the manufacturing sector, which needs the maximum investment. So something is wrong, and I'm going to get to that. Then I think it was pointed out by the chairman also that we are a developing country, and history tells us that no country has moved from a developing to a developed stage without going through the process of industrialization. What is our asset? Our asset is our young population. We can consider it as an asset, or we can make it a liability. But that labor force has to be gainfully employed and has to be working. And for that to work, we need to expand our manufacturing base. That has been shrinking. Cutting this point short and giving you an example, for I think the 23rd time we are in an IMF program and which got derailed, and we are trying to put it back on track. What do we think? I mean, IMF model is simple: monetary tightening by increasing the rates, slowing down the growth, which will impact the imports, reducing the trade deficit, the current account deficit. The growth comes down to 1 or 2%. The inflation, they try to bring it down and then start all over again. But do we think that if we go down in the growth and then 2 years later, when we go back to the growth cycle, which is inevitable because this country cannot survive in a growth cycle of 1 or 2 or 3%. This country will survive in a growth cycle of 7 to 8%, sustained over a number of years. That's when we will move from a developing country and move close to being a developed country. So my question to all of you is that what will happen after 2 or 3 years, provided that we go through a successful IMF program, that when the growth cycle starts, that we will not be hit once again with a trade deficit and a current account deficit. Would we start getting all of a sudden huge foreign investment? Would our own domestic investors come back into the manufacturing sector and start investing there, and we will move towards an export-led growth? And IMF is not going to give you a program for that. IMF is only going to give you a program to bail you out. Once you're bailed out, they're only interested in getting their money back. The program after the bailout has to be indigenous. That has to be our own program. And that is where we have failed always, sometimes partially successful. But as soon as we start growing, we feel that in the last cycle, 2013, 2014, we hit the current account deficit problem in the 4th or the 5th year of the government. But at that time, we were growing close to 6% at an inflation rate of about 4%. Policy rate was about 7%. So things were okay. But this year, after the pandemic, as soon as we hit the growth cycle, within a couple of quarters, we hit the current account deficit problem. So it was worse this time, and it happened much faster. So we did not learn any lessons from the last program. So here is the problem. We first have to attract our own Pakistani businessmen out of all this doom and gloom. The countries that have risen through the private sector. The governments have not made the countries prosperous. The governments have facilitated the private sector to make countries prosperous. Our country has a mindset which thinks that governments get rich because of their policies, because something happens somewhere and the governments get rich. No. People get rich, businessmen get rich. Look at South Korea, look at Japan, look at China. They have conglomerates. They all started by single individuals. But we consider that as a sin. Somebody getting rich here is a sin. If somebody gets rich and pays its taxes, he should be saluted because he creates jobs. And when a lot of people do that, a lot of people make money, you reinvest, you expand, you put new plants. And when you do all that, then you pay taxes and your tax base goes up. You can't keep squeezing taxes from the already shrunken base. So my solution is that people are intimidated to invest in Pakistan. What happens is you give an amnesty in real estate and all the money goes into real estate, which has caused the inflation, which has caused the steel prices to go up, cement prices to go up because of fuel, and which has got the land prices to go up, and which has got the rentals to go up, the houses price to go up. So what it was intended to do to make it possible for middle class or poor people to afford a house, it did exactly the opposite to that. And it moved a lot of money from the productive sector to the unproductive sector. And it was speculative. People made a lot of money. They spent the money. The imported goods, they spent the money. There was consumerism and all that. But it was temporary. It was a bubble. So we've got to expand the manufacturing base. And the example I gave you, as the economy grows, our imports grows, not because our exports are growing, but basically because our domestic economy now is primarily based on imports. Our fuel, first, initially it was only petrol and diesel. Now it is LNG, it is coal. When we were adding last time around, we were adding all these plants, there was a very good renewable energy program, but they discontinued it because at that point in time, the rupee was stable and LNG imports were cheaper and coal was very cheap, and they discontinued the renewable energy program. We've got to get back on that because even though it is expensive at the beginning, but it is indigenous, it is renewable. and we don't have to spend dollars in that. So right now, the model is the moment you're going to go for growth, your imports are going to go up. So you've got to do something about that. And no matter what, right now, the way the duty is structured, we cannot compete with China. We had an FTA 1 free trade agreement. Now we have an FTA 2, which means 70% tariffs. It applies on 70% tariffs, and 70% goods can be imported from China. And in return, what they gave us for exports is not working. Even the Chinese ambassador the other day said it's lopsided, do something about it. So all these appliances that are made in Pakistan, they're assembled in Pakistan. Even the screws that are used in assembling it, they're imported from China. Imagine in the last 10 years, I mean, we have imported about $25 billion of mobile phones. We import almost over $2 billion of palm oil for vegetable ghee. We have not been able to replace it by our domestic crops. We can't, we import machinery. We can make nuclear bombs, and we can make jet fighters, and we can make missiles, but we have not been able to make a motorcycle engine. We've been assembling motorcycles for the last 50 years now, but we have not been able to make motorcycle engines. We cannot make fine steel. We import that. Even one steel mill that was working has been bankrupt for the last decade or so. So we have to develop a basic industry. We have to develop the steel industry. We have to give some protection for import substitution. We have to. I mean, that will cost us a little bit in inflation temporarily, but in the long run, it will help us. Because I personally think that in our country, as we develop and as we go to the 7 to 8% growth model, sustainable growth model, we cannot probably have a 3 to 4% inflation, but maybe we can live with 5% inflation. But go to the GDP 7 to 8% model. That is the only solution. That will help you face fiscal deficit. That will help you increase your taxes also. When people are making money, they pay taxes also. You have to increase the business cycle. Today, there is so much fear and intimidation in the business community. Imagine billions of dollars declared in 2 amnesty schemes. They don't bring the money here. Why? We are a highly taxed nation. That is the irony. And still, the tax to GDP ratio is one of the lowest in the region. We are a highly taxed region. We pay taxes on electricity bills. We pay taxes on gas bills. We pay taxes on real estate deals. We pay taxes when we buy motorcycles. We buy a car. We pay taxes every time we move, spend money. And there is a lot of documentation also. I mean, there's a documentation with the provinces, and there is documentation in NADRA, and there is documentation. We have the Anti-Money Laundering Act. We have the Prohibition of Benami Transaction Act. We have exchange of information now under the OECD Multilateral Convention. So we have all the wherewithal now to be a properly, or at least close to be a properly documented economy. The only problem is that we do not have the use of credit cards, so a lot of purchases are cash purchases. The other thing, just covering the tax point, I think we only tax 80% of our economy. The other 20% is agriculture. No government, even the martial law governments, have not been able to tax that, because under the Constitution, the federal government cannot collect income tax on agriculture. Now, the provinces have an agriculture income tax, but they have not been able to collect it, and they have no will to collect it, because all provincial assemblies are full of feudals and all that. But I don't want to get into the political thing. So as a first step, we should hand over the responsibility of collecting agriculture income tax to the FBR. It should be should go to the provincial the provinces, but at least the collection mechanism, until the provinces develop a good collection collection mechanism of income tax. They have developed a good collection mechanism for sales tax and services, but not on income tax. So that gap can be covered there. The other gap, a lot of gaps have been plugged in. The price bonds, they have to be registered now. Foreign TTs, they are now limited. Questions can be asked. One gap which is still there is the real estate. I mean, because we did not trust the DC rates, we brought in the FBR rates. The next step is to make the FBR rates, revise them every quarter and make them as close as possible to the market. There is no way that there are two agreements, sale agreements. One agreement with the FBR rate or the DC rate and the other real agreement. That money is undocumented. And when you gave amnesty, 400 to 500 billion rupees was shifted here. So we can tax the current base more because it's already bleeding. We have to expand the base and we have to expand the taxes as we grow. Now, coming back on the way forward, I personally think that these investigative agencies, not only have they ruined the efficiency and the initiative of the bureaucracy, they have really ruined the business desire of the businessmen to invest in this country. I mean, you'll be surprised to hear that a lot of businessmen, big groups, when they have some extra cash available in their companies, they invest in real estate. They park their money in real estate because they are not sure whether if it remains at the bank, some agency, FIA or NAB or some agency is going to come and freeze their accounts. They freeze the accounts first and then send them a notice. So a lot has happened. I came back in 90, and in my 30 years, things for businessmen have deteriorated. The other point is, quickly going forward, if a businessman wants to invest in this country, there are two things that you need. You need equity and you need debt. Where is the debt available? There's no development financial institution left. I don't have to name them. There were several, half a dozen development financial institutions. There's no long-term financing available. Imagine somebody who invested in a business last year with Kaibar with policy rate at 7% or Kaibar at 7%. Today, Kaibar is at 14%. Could he have incorporated that in his feasibility at that time? No. So when he goes towards bankruptcy, there's nobody to help him. Then he's a willful defaulter and he goes to NAB. There's no Chapter 11 bankruptcy. There's no protection. So one element is debt. It's not available. There's no long-term debt available. The state bank come in and do something. There are a few schemes here and there, but it's hardly available now. And the equity. How many IPOs have you heard about? Yeah, 3, 4, 5 IPOs, but a country with 220 million population, are these enough? No, they're not enough. So that you have to bring in almost 50 to 60% of the cost of the whole project as your own equity. So that reduces the list of probable investors. And then you have to do a Herculean task to go to the banks, to the private banks, to collect money, because almost as Dr. Pasha said, that the private sector has been crowded out, and with this 15% government borrowing, who's going to lend to the private sector? There's no desire with the banks to lend money to the private sector. Why would they lend money to the private sector? If they can invest their money at 15% with the government, zero risk, guaranteed return, why would they invest money in the private sector? So the elements and the tools to increase to expand the manufacturing sector and to lure in businessmen and the small business is not there. We've got to establish those. Look at the imports of our staple food items. We've been importing wheat. We've been importing sugar. This is the first year after many years that we have a surplus sugar production, but 1 million tons, which can fetch you $600 million. But nobody's taking any decision on that. It's lying there. I mean, the next 2-3 months, you can have about $600 million, but we're not making use of it. But anyways, that's a separate subject. So what is happening is a lot of our imports are also to feed our people, because we are running out of fertile land, because we are not conserving water. We all know that we haven't made any dam since 1970, but they are in the works. It will take time, and no government is interested. Turnaround period of a dam is not 5 years, and by that time they go into the election and they don't have to they don't show anything as their performance. And as a result of that, what happens is that we are perhaps one of the lowest crop yielding countries in the world. I am associated with a business which is heavily focused on agriculture. And I give you an example. In 30 years of my being in this business, I have never seen a person or never gotten a call from the agriculture extension, provincial agriculture extension departments who are responsible for crop development and crop yields. I've been hearing all sorts of things that we'll do this and we'll do that. It never happens. Look at the obsolete irrigation model we have. Irrigation by flooding the water into the field, because that is easy. That is in a comfort zone. We don't want to get into the drip irrigation, or that. Our research is perhaps the worst in the world. We do not develop seeds which can yield more by using less water. And I'll summarize this. I was in Australia about 10 years ago, and the guy who was driving me, everybody's literate there, so you can get into a good intellectual talk with them. And I told them at that time, I think Australia was growing like in the last 50 years, Australia had doubled its population. In the last 50 years, we have more than quadrupled our population. So I said, how have you controlled your population like that? He said, and mind you, I mean, there are a lot of migrants there also. They said, long time back, we realized that we are primarily 90% a desert. So if we don't control our population, we'll all starve to death. So, I mean, that kind of sense doesn't exist in our country. We're always waiting for a great miracle to happen, things from coming from somewhere, and we run around and do that. So I've taken a lot of time. I think basically this country will be turned around by its own people first, which will be followed by the foreigners. Foreigners will never come to this country if their own people are not investing. We go for quick kills. And then some people say that such and such person made $1 billion in a real estate and all that, or in some business. You don't measure economies like that, because people made billions in the Iraq war also. People are still making billions, some people in Afghanistan. But what we have to see the country as a whole, the bottom line is, today, we are running around and trying to get help to build our reserves. And it's available at a very high cost. And I totally agree with Dr. Pasha that if we continue going that road, then the economy is in a free fall. But the light at the end of the tunnel is, because I am also in the private sector, I personally think that we have the potential. This country is very resilient. It has gone through wars. It has gone through separation. It has gone through terrorism. But still there is a lot of hope. But let the people come back and put their money here. Give them confidence. Give them, guarantee their money. People are afraid. We have so many regulations. I mean, in the world, these regulations exist. We just copy these regulations, but we apply it, to every other or third business house. You don't do that. The regulator should remain as a regulator. The regulator should not get involved in the running or not running of a business. And so at the end, I feel maybe there are a lot of good institutions working in this country. Individually, if you can try to analyze the performance of one institution or one regulator, it will be good. But collectively, they're not giving us the performance. So that interconnection and that vision and that holistic view has to come from leadership, and that is missing. And that is where I'll end. There is or can be a lot of hope. None exists today. I do not see among the things around me and the options around me, I see we will go from very bad to less bad or worse or something like that, and may remain afloat, God willing. And I do not see any leadership coming up and taking us forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. And you fulfilled a very important part of this program by bringing in a very practically informed view, as well as sharing with us some ground truths. Your insightful comments have helped us all. We now move to a topic that lies at the center of our economic troubles, where we look at alternative ways for managing Pakistan's foreign debt. And there's no better speaker on the topic than Tim Jones. Tim is head of policy at Debt Justice, formerly Jubilee Debt Campaign, a UK charity working around the world to end poverty caused by unjust debt. They do so through education, research, and campaigning. Tim is a trained political economist holding a first-class degree in economics and politics and a master's with distinction in international political economy. He has worked for Debt Justice for over 11 years, before which he worked for Global Justice Now for 8 years, campaigning on debt, trade agreements, and climate change. His research on international trade has been widely cited in leading publications, including the Financial Times, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and The Guardian, among many others. He has spoken on panels at the IMF, the Paris Club, and the UN. Tim is based in London. Thank you for taking time to join this meeting, Tim. You have the virtual floor.
Good evening. It's a great honor to be with you all this evening. So I will try and give some perspectives as an outsider at some of the international processes that are happening with external debt and how they may or may not be relevant to Pakistan's debt situation. I'll try and if it's possible for the host to allow me to share my screen, I've just got a few slides to share. So Pakistan's debt payments are expected to be very high for the next few years. This is external debt payments, so payments leaving the country as a proportion of government revenue. Going back to 1998, and then the colours in orange are the IMF predictions for 2022 to 2026. And you can see that they are well over 30% of government revenue. The IMF baseline for when countries tend to have a problem paying external debt is between 15 and 20% of government revenue on a sustained basis. So these payments are well above that level. In our research, we have found that when payments are over 15% of government revenue, then governments tend to have to cut spending, stagnate spending in the actual economy. And I think, as we covered earlier, the external debt is owed to a variety of creditors. This is according to the World Bank. It might not include some of the shorter term forex debts, but a substantial amount is owed to China, the large blue segment, but by nowhere, I mean, just under a third. There are then significant amounts owed to other governments, to private lenders, and then very large amounts to multilateral institutions, in particular to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. So yeah, there's a wide variety of creditors the multilaterals are a very important part of the creditor profile, as well as China and the private lenders. Then this graph shows the of those private lenders, the bond prices for one of Pakistan's external bonds. So when it is at 100, that means the bond is trading at face value. So speculators are buying and selling that debt at the amount of debt that is owed. Over the course of this year, the price of these bonds has fallen dramatically, so it's now less than 60 cents on the dollar. So external lenders are selling and buying Pakistan's debt for $1,000 for just $600. Now, the key thing that this indicates is that private lenders are indicating they're not willing to lend anymore to the Pakistan government. This is a kind of forward-looking indicator that those loans would either be extremely high interest or more likely just are not available anymore. Now, the reason I want to introduce all that is to get onto the key point around restructuring or cancelling debt. So the International Monetary Fund says generally across the world, debt restructurings have often been too little and too late, thus failing to re-establish debt sustainability and market access in a durable way. So the IMF says that what tends to be the case is that governments keep paying external debt for too long. So there is an assumption that that is the right thing to do. It's a good thing to do to be able to maintain your access to borrowing from financial markets, and that therefore when restructuring happens, it's too late. Too much money has gone out, the reserves have been depleted too much, and that has much larger economic ramifications than if a restructuring of the debt had been sought sooner. The IMF has also found that its programs tend to be more successful in countries with debt restructuring. So for countries with a high debt, the IMF programs are judged to be much more successful if there is a restructuring of the debt, getting some of the debt cancelled at the start, rather than countries where there's a high debt and all of the debt keeps being paid. So these figures show that in countries with a debt restructuring, IMF programs have been successful or partially successful 85% of the time, without a debt restructuring 50% of the time. So the common reason, despite all this given, why governments don't want to restructure debt is because it will upset lenders and mean they will never lend again. And this just is not true. It's important with all of this to be clear about what debt is being talked about. This is with the external debt, not the domestic debt. Now, if that external debt, particularly owed to private lenders, stops being paid, then those private lenders won't lend anymore. But that is already the case, that private lenders are not willing to lend anymore. The trouble is that if you keep paying, then eventually the reserves are depleted, and so when then a default happens, it happens in a much more panicked way and in a worse economic situation. Sri Lanka is an example of a country that simply was paying its debt for too long. This is Sri Lanka's government external debt payments as a percentage of government revenue, which have been very high for decades, but since the early 2010s, they were over 20% of government revenue, and then have been over 30% since 2017. Sri Lanka has made a large point about keeping on paying the debt and carried on right until its reserves have been completely depleted. And now it's in a horrendous situation where it's struggling to import at all. So with a restructuring, by acting sooner and restructuring debt, that then makes it possible actually to be able to borrow again, because the reason private lenders don't want to lend more is because they think they're not going to get repaid. So the higher the debt is, the less willing they are to lend. Whereas if a restructuring leads to a more sustainable debt situation, then they may be willing to lend again. So going back to that International Monetary Fund, debt restructurings are both too little and too late to re-establish debt sustainability, but also to get market access in a durable way. Another quote, this is from the ratings agency Scope Ratings. If an economy's debt sustainability is adequately enhanced via public and private sector debt relief, this could support stronger market access and lower borrowing rates longer term, and with this potentially a stronger credit rating longer term. So if debt restructuring can make the debt smaller, then that then can lead to being able to borrow at cheaper interest rates in the future. So I'll stop sharing my screen now. I would like to argue that therefore it is worth considering restructuring the external debt and to get debt payments down. There is a huge gap in the international architecture that there is no UN system for restructuring international debts. There was a vote a few years ago, but a handful of rich countries blocked it from happening. So in the absence of that, the International Monetary Fund often plays a key role. And that's not to say we think that's the right thing to do, but that is the system, how it works. And so the IMF in its loan programs says whether debt is sustainable or unsustainable. If sustainable, they can agree a loan. If unsustainable, they can also agree a loan, but only if a government proactively seeks to restructure the debt in a way that will make it sustainable in the future. And from conversations I've had over many years with IMF staff, obviously there's a contradiction in that they say that more debt should be being restructured up front, but yet they don't seem to say that in their loan programs. And they explain that to me by saying that often governments put pressure on them to declare a debt sustainable. So it's governments actively pushing them to want to keep paying the debt rather than seek a restructuring. The opposite approach is possible, to get the IMF to declare the debt unsustainable and use that as a way to increase pressure on creditors to agree to a debt restructuring in negotiations. So if the IMF declares a debt unsustainable, they then can also say how much debt needs to be cancelled through a restructuring to make it sustainable again in the future. The IMF also has something called the lending into arrears policy, which says that if a government is seeking a debt restructuring that will make the debt sustainable, but creditors aren't accepting that, then the government can default on those creditors and still receive IMF funding and support. What that policy does is put pressure on creditors to accept a deal, because it creates a credible threat that they won't be paid if they don't accept the restructuring deal. So the IMF arguably shouldn't be central to debt relief and to debt cancellation, but it is, and the IMF has policies that governments can use to increase their power in negotiations with creditors. In recent years, another key thing that has happened is negotiations at the G20 on debt relief. So at the end of 2020, the G20 agreed the common framework. And this is a scheme that is meant to enable debt restructurings. 73 countries are eligible, Pakistan is one. And under it, debtor can apply for it and then seek debt restructuring both with its bilateral creditors and with its private creditors. Again, the IMF does a debt assessment with the government to agree what scale of restructuring is needed on the external debt. And then bilateral creditors and negotiations then happen with bilateral and private creditors. Crucially, the G20 governments are all signed up to this scheme. So in theory, that includes China is signed up to the common framework and willing to do debt restructurings. So this is potentially a tool that Pakistan could seek to use. The good news is that China is signed up and that there are mechanisms to try and force private creditors to take part in a restructuring, such as the IMF lending into arrears policy. The challenging aspect of the external debt is that the multilateral institutions are not signed up to the common framework. So the, in some sense, hypocrisy of how particularly the IMF and World Bank have approached the debt issue over recent years is that they have been very forthright in calling for the need for debt relief and debt cancellation on bilateral and private debt, but they've not been willing to consider it for the debt owed to themselves. So they have managed to keep themselves as institutions out of these restructuring frameworks. So going back to that pie chart I showed at the start, the debt owed to China, the debt owed to private creditors is all potentially up for restructuring through the common framework. To go further than that could require Pakistan to be more challenging of the multilaterals and their role and the need for them also to be involved in restructuring. That might be needed both in order to make the external debt sustainable, but also for there are indications that China is not happy that Western lenders and Western multilateral institutions keep avoiding debt relief. And so China might also want to push for multilateral institutions to also be included in any restructuring. So this is obviously just one small part of the economic challenge and doesn't solve the underlying problems, except for the fact that one of the underlying problems is the huge external debt burden that has existed for many years. And so reducing that burden is a necessary but not sufficient step to dealing with all the other challenges. But there are frameworks out there and policies in the current environment which could be used. So we as international civil society are campaigning for these frameworks to be improved, to be made better for debtor countries. But it was also important that governments act to take creditors on, to not just assume that the best thing to do is to pay high profits to the creditors who've lent money, but actually to challenge that and to tackle it sooner rather than later, rather than keep paying and dwindling reserves and then only actually tackling the huge external debt burden once the money has already run out. So I just wanted to share some of those perspectives on the external debt situation and some of the tools and policies that are available, and would be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That was gripping stuff and a refreshing perspective on how to exit this very difficult situation that we are in. Perhaps we need to be engaged a little bit further and do this, do these exchanges more often. We now go to questions and answers. I have 3 or 4 hands up already. So we will start with Senator Faratullah Babar. I have a couple of requests, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. The first is, click the raise hand icon. But the more important request is that please keep your comments short, because we are a little over time, and I don't know, I have to ask the speakers if they can stay how much beyond 7. Of course, we are past 7 already. So we want to get as many questions as possible. So we begin with Senator Faruqullah Babar. After that, we go to Ismail Qureshi, Shaukat Hamid Khan, Sayyid Rizvi, and I think that must be General Sikandar. There's a Sikandar there. So those are the 4 or 5 names. First, Faruqullah Babar Sahab.
I have just 2 quick questions. Of course, I want to compliment the Institute of Policy Reforms, you and Akhtar Rahman Sahab, everybody. My 2 questions are: number 1, what is the impact of 2 parallel economies in the country? One run by the military and the other by the civil political government. Hafiz Pasha Sahab is here. He himself has in his book stated FW has become the largest contractor. Fauji Foundation has become the largest industrial commercial conglomerate, and the DHA has become the largest real estate developer. So my first question is, what is the impact, the negative impact on the national economy of the 2 parallel economies in the country? My second question, of course, is, that we emphasize indirect taxation. Why not emphasize direct taxation?
We go
And
to
what
Ismail
are,
Qureshi.
the impediments in the way?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashraf. Well,
Thank you, sir.
as always.
Okay.
Great webinar, I think, and great speakers. And I want to thank you all very much. And Pasha Saab, thank you very much to you, sir, especially. Very erudite. I was just wondering about this doom and gloom, but I'm sure Pasha Saab has something to suggest. Given what we have now is a government which is not very sure of how long it's going to be there. And also, there is a very serious political breakdown between the 2 or 3 major political parties. Given this situation as it is, how do we ensure that there is a political convergence and we agree on a way forward, which is both short to medium to long term? Thank you.
Thank you, Ismail. Shaukat Hamid Khan.
Thank you for this opportunity to listen to some excellent summaries and reviews of what is wrong with Pakistan. But I'd like to, with your permission, add 1 or 2 small items. And they are this, that we've only been talking about so-called agriculture, industries, service sector in general, but we've forgotten the main thrust of what is happening in the last 20 years in the world. There's a new emerging morphology of the global economy. There's a transnational vertical division of labor, diffusion of work, technology, and ownership caused by technology. And as Pascal Lamy said about 10, 15 years ago, there's an irrevocable shift of manufacturing from developed to developing countries. But now designing also can be undertaken almost anywhere. Already the honorable speakers have mentioned the case of South Korea and so on. But one thing is, even in the developed countries, even when their productivity growth has slowed down, the rate of increase in the skill bias in technology has not. And even in the developing world, there is less and less demand for what you call sharp reduction, in fact, in emerging policies for unskilled labor. And the problem in Pakistan is that we can have policies, we can have programs, but we cannot implement them on the ground. It's not a question of economics only. It's a question, for example, there's something like 650 million people. I think Mr. Harun Akhtar talked about water and agriculture. 650 million gallons per day coming to Karachi, not a single drop is recycled. But water, technology, well, from my lab, nice little product came out called the laser land leveler. About 5,000 have been sold in the country, and India also has imported them. But what I'm trying to say is, it is all this leads to one factor, that even when we try and improve our economy, we try and do it by selling, but we do not sell what people require. We do not sell what the world requires. And skills is the only thing to do it. And I'll give you an example. My last research was in Geneva at the CERN accelerator. I was very happy to see Pakistani textiles in the super malls and the shops there. Within a year, they were replaced by Bangladeshi things. We produce the cotton, but they produce the goods. They produce the finished products. So this is the problem everywhere, that we are not doing enough to leverage what we have. And I rightly pointed out, but all I'm trying to say is, please, we have enough policies. Let's talk about implementing them. Let's talk about people who will implement them. And this is what I would like to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shaukat Hamid. Shaukat Saab is a physicist and a very eminent one. We go to Syed Rizvi.
Thank you, Ashraf. As always, a great webinar. I will just start with Mr. Humayun Akhtar's very informed, knowledgeable briefing on it. And I would just like to request him to, and ask him a question also, that at his time, when he was in Musharraf's time, there was some great, progress in this regard, economy, and we were having less reliance on IMF. How did he achieve at that time? What were the policy salient features? Briefly, if you could share. Another question I would like to have, and for the whole panel, I see here with some debt to GDP ratio of Japan is 234.18. Debt to GDP ratio. Greece is 181.78%, right? And Canada, 83.8%. China is 54%, and Russia, 19.1%. In fact, is the least indebted country in the world. Despite all the things that we are hearing about, why are they not bothered about it as much when we talk about debt to GDP? And as we are now concerned by this thing that we have got about 6% of some shortfall, something if they can be, they can touch upon. This is for the whole panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question was for Humayun Saab. And the second question, if I could ask Tim to handle that. Tariq Ikram Saab.
Okay, thank you very much, Ji. A very good evening to all participants, and thank you for the opportunity. I'd just like to ask a very simple question, जिसको हम मासूमाना सवाल कहते हैं. Invariably, with all the discourses, Pasha Saab, Humayun Akhtar, and before them, so many people, debt, servicing takes away our fiscal space, and etc. To debt, of course, means both local debt and international debt. Now, the sources of money which could reduce debt are well known. And the most consistent one is the amount that you can export on goods and services. And I apologize for having to repeat the subject of exports again and again and again, and I will continue to do so, because that seems to be the fundamental issue. My question is to all three learned speakers to specifically highlight why is it that in spite of the fact that World Bank has said our export potential is $88 billion, and I feel it is between $80 and $100 billion, why is it that knowing this, we have not been able to increase exports, especially when we look at Bangladesh and others who were able to do it with no better situation than ourselves? What specifically are the reasons? 1, 2, 3.
Zainab Rizvi.
Thank you very much, Ji. Well, just quickly, one of the speakers rightly mentioned about the agriculture sector and the water consumption. As we know that industry hardly uses 10-15% of the water, and 80%, 75% is the agriculture sector. a tremendous wastage there, And I think that from the too well to the field, about 70-80% of the water is wasted. So I think this is very, very important, as Pakistan is one of those countries which is projected to be facing water famine by 2025. I think it's a very right point suggested. Second, my quick comment is that in Pakistan, we have been always talking of export promotion, subsidies, export promotion, while we see the economies which have really grown, they have worked on import substitution. And if we go give subsidies for the import substitution, you subsidize the local consumer. When you give lots of incentives and subsidies for the exports, you practically subsidize the foreign consumer. So I think this issue should also be somewhere addressed by us. And I think this last is the quick debt restructuring. We have been hearing about it since long, many, many years, but not really never been effectively attended to. Also the 3Ds by is 3Ds, yes, there was a time in 70s and 80s. Our defense was number one, debt servicing was number two, and then the public sector development budget. Over the years, debt servicing has become number one, defense still number two, and there is always practically very little money for the development. So I think these are the issues which we have been saying over the years, but probably the economic stalwarts and the leadership failed to address this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zaram Bhai. We have a couple of more questions. Well, there are two more. So let me just finish with those two and then go to the speakers. And then I will ask Humayun Saab to wind up the discussion. The first is, well, it's M231241. We can go to, and then we'll go to Tariq Hamid.
I'm not an economist. I'm not a financial manager, but I'm just a layman. I'm going to ask 3 questions, very short and brief questions. First is, when are we going to reduce government expenditure by shrinking the manpower? When are we going to reduce our consumption of fuel? And when are we going to reduce the population in the country? And the one comment I have, previous speaker talked about water consumption. There is an institute coming up in Karachi, in NED University, on water institute and research. I think that's going to be a very good institute, and the government must lend all its hand to develop it as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Admiral Bakar was with the Navy, and my question to him would be, but you don't have to answer it. When you say reduce government expenditure, does that mean does that include the Navy also? Tariq Hamid.
Thank you, Ashraf. Thank you for inviting me, and very good to be part of an August group. Just a couple of comments here. First of all, the situation we are in is not surprising. We could figure it out over the years that we would end up in a very difficult situation. Look at the amount of resources or the quantity of resources we have allocated to human capital over the last 70 years. It's been extraordinarily low, and the results we are seeing today. So that's one comment. The second is that when I was thinking of investing, I'm based in London. So when I was thinking of investing, one of the things I looked at, how good is the judicial system in that country? And I'm afraid Pakistan does not stand very high in there. And then there is a saying, I think it was Samuel Jackson, or I don't remember the name of the author, that integrity without knowledge is weakness, and knowledge without integrity is dangerous. I leave it there. Thank you.
All right, Tariq, thank you. We go to the speakers now. And I'm sorry that we've overstepped the time. Can we go to Dr. Hafiz Pasha first? We'll go in the order that they spoke. Hafiz Pasha Saab, Harun Saab, and then Tim. Tim, unless you have to leave because it's the middle of the working day in London. And then I'll ask Humayun Saab to wind up and close the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, can I come in quickly, very quickly? Let
Yes,
me
sir.
start with a very important observation made by the first commenter or questioner, which is Mr. Ismail Qureshi, and the need in the presence of a serious political background as to why we cannot proceed towards some kind of medium-term perspective. See, what I find surprising is that we are being told today that Pakistan has a coalition government with 11 parties who presumably represent almost 70% of the vote. Now, if this is the case, then why is there an opportunity not being taken to evolve a consensus on medium-term policy? You know, I, as a retired professor, completed a book on Charter of the Economy, which has been widely publicized, and of course, it is given to the political leaders. I'd be happy to send this to Ghani, IPR, and please, you could circulate the soft copy of that, if that is useful. It's a very carefully drafted book. I thought it would turn out to be the first draft of a discussion on agenda. The other point that I'd like to, the other point is on the, you see, the repayment ratio, which has been quoted by Mr. Jones. Actually, Pakistan's net revenues are in the range of $20 billion only. And today, if we project the external debt liability repayment, it's next year is $17 billion. So that ratio actually turns out to be close to 85%, unfortunately. Then I thought a very important point was made about why can we not also begin to focus on import substitution? It's very interesting that Pakistan's first breakthrough of growth initially was through import substitution. And it was only later on that we were able to develop the textile sector as the main export artery. Now that we have this problem of a huge trade imbalance, I'm afraid the time has come once again to begin to think in terms of some degree of protection to our domestic industry. The problem has been that over the last many years, particularly under pressure from the IMF, we have been opening up the economy and liberalizing the economy. And today you'll be shocked to know that Pakistan has the lowest import tariffs in South Asia. And in particular, agriculture is one sector where Pakistan has an average tariff rate of 5-6%, whereas India today has an average tariff of 40%. We have done little, and believe it or not, today we have a zero duty on cotton. I mean, this is just shows how far we have gone away from this effort at trying to at least protect our own producing entities, firms, and farmers. So I will have already suggested to the government that we should revert back to the import tariff structure Pakistan had about 7 or 8 years ago, where the maximum rate had gone up to 30%. Now it is 20%. And we ensure that we give more protection, particularly to agriculture. And very importantly, we have to have some kind of very important observation made about the imbalance in the Chinese free trade agreement with Pakistan. They are exporting 7 times as much as we are exporting to them. The time has come to review the free trade agreement, and frankly, with all due respects, the quantum of under-invoicing and so on and so forth that has gone on is really something which has crippled our domestic industry. So I totally agree with this point, and in support of that, I have actually written recently and conveyed this to the government that we should move. The only exception that I would make is basic food items and possibly medicines. Then I will turn to this question of the impact of the two parallel economies, which is a question which was raised as to what is the extent of the parallel economies. I just worked on this when I was doing the Human Development Report on inequality. And Senator Saab, I have been through a very difficult time since then as an individual, the amount of pressure that has been put on. The point is today, the economic imprint of the military in Pakistan is very large. In annual terms, the net income that is generated, we have estimated, is close to anywhere between 250 to 300 billion through these various activities which you mentioned. It would have been fine if this had happened in a very competitive environment. Believe it or not, it's not competitive. It's a question of privileged access, tax reliefs. I mean, for example, cantonment stores don't pay any sales tax. So it's this point about our private sector, civilian private sector, which we have been trying to make, that let's have a per market-based environment with equal access and opportunity to all and no privileges as such, particularly in the context, for example, of the cantonment areas. So this was a difficult set of points that I made, and I've been through a lot of pressure for that. Last point I would like to make is on the human capital point, a very important observation. Pakistan's investment in education and in various forms of training and investment in particularly in technical and vocational training is the lowest in South Asia. And the tragedy is that now that we are reaching this resource constraint stage in our growth, the provinces have cut back their investment in education. You will be shocked to know that just yesterday, the universities of Pakistan, public universities, have been told that the grant to them will be cut by 2/3. This is unbelievable what is happening. So yes, this is a country which has not invested in human capital. And the tragedy is that whatever we have invested is not being used because it's not appropriate, it's not market relevant. You will be surprised to know that the unemployment rate of the most educated people of Pakistan with degrees and postgraduate qualifications is the highest among different levels of education. It is 16%. And the other point which was made about the youth, believe it or not, there are 7 million idle youth in this country, waiting, God knows for what. Some of it has been transmitted into crime already and also totalitarianism. God forbid, this is another bomb waiting to explode. So I must compliment the questions that have been asked. Some of them are very leading questions. We do not have the time, but let me tell you, sir, that I have researched for 40 years on Pakistan. I've guided over 100 PhDs. In my heart, let me tell you that I am more worried today about my country's future than I have ever been before. This is where I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pasha Saab, and thank you very much for sharing your time with us and your knowledge. Harun Akhtar Khan, sir? Could I ask you a question that's been asked by a young professional in the oil and gas exploration business? Can we import gas from Iran and Turkmenistan, as LNG import is very expensive? If you could cover that as well.
Okay. Ashraf, thank you. Very quickly, as we are already running short of time. Ismail Qureshi Saab, very honorable political divide. We've been talking about this Charter of Economy since a decade, and Dr. Pasha just told us that he had written a book on it. I personally think it will never happen in Pakistan. I personally think we have added the political economic rhetoric to our general political rhetoric, and that will go on, and that has hurt our economy. It's my personal view that this setup of 11 governments, 11 parties, is not going to continue for too long. It cannot. The differences will arise. They're already risen after the rise in the petrol prices and a further rise expected. I think the solution right now is to pass the budget and go into an election. Shaukat Saab, software, absolutely. I did not cover that in my remarks because I think Pakistan has just started to do well, and Pakistan software companies and startups are beginning to raise money, and they have gotten some focus from the investors in the Silicon Valley, and some of the good brains that have been a part of the brain drain in Pakistan are coming back to Pakistan, and I hope that this is going to flourish. I think we don't learn from our mistakes. We have failed to run our airline. We haven't done anything to it. We have failed to run our railways. We have not done anything on that. Every government comes and promises to do something, and they have been unable to do anything whatsoever. We have failed to run a steel mill, and so on and so forth. So we must get rid of these things, and if we do not have talent to run these enterprises, we should sell them. And in general, anything that we have not, like the agriculture research, that we have not been able to successfully run, we should hire the experts in the world. That is, we should not be shy of doing that. The experts can come, run the institutes, start the institutes, train our people, and then leave. So we should accept failure, but until we do not accept failure, we are not going to find the solutions. Rizvi Saab, I think that's a question for Humayun Saab, Musharraf Era, and I think he should be able to answer that. Debt to GDP ratio, the only reason why Japan is not worried about 234% and Canada may not be worried about it, because their ability to pay back debt is much better and much higher than ours. Our 85% is a problem because of our tax to GDP ratio and tax collection, and our ability to pay this debt is not there, and that is why 85% is a trouble for us. Honorable Tariq Akram Saab, you've been in the Export Promotion Bureau board and all that. I mean, what can I say? But just a remark in that if we can, we were just told that at one time our exports to GDP ratio was 19%, and earlier this century it was 17%. So if we keep on going that, I mean, we should have reached $60 billion so far. So the expanding economy is not contributing equally or proportionally to the export. So that's a problem which needs to be discussed. Zagab Rizvi Saab, water conservation is, I mean, I could have spoken on it, but it's very sad. I mean, we are a country with the monsoons, God-gifted melting of the glaciers and all that. It's just water conservation that we don't do. Singapore doesn't have its own water. I mean, it has a pipeline which pulls water from Malaysia, and they don't have a great relation with Malaysia. So they have the world's largest water recycling research center there. So that's how I mean, they don't consider themselves handicapped by something they don't have. They found solutions for that. And that again comes back to leadership. Export subsidies, I think, yeah, there's a long debate on that. Sometimes the export subsidies, as Dr. Pasha, I learned from him, when we keep the rupee stable for a long time and our exports suffer, and then we give targeted subsidies rather than devaluing our rupee. That's another strategy, and we only give it to make our exports competitive when the other countries in the region are also subsidizing their exports. Honorable Senator Babar Saab, I would not comment on that. I think Dr. Pasha has already commented on that, but I think the military finds its space because if you talk of DHA, they've done a good job at DHA. I mean, the colonies are organized, they are clean, they have a sewage system, they have electricity and all that. And people investing money are secure with the titles and all that. So that's one reason, but we can discuss in detail some other time. Direct taxation is against, I think we try hard to do that. Our tax collection system is still not sophisticated enough to find out if the money is being hidden in a statement, in an accounting statement. So that is why they go for indirect taxation, advanced taxes, withholding tax, and so on and so forth. Because if they reduce that, then the tax to GDP ratio will fall even further. Vice Admiral Bakr Saab, water conservation, we already discussed. Government expenses, how can we reduce that? I mean, we all talk about that. We have not been able to reduce it. It's a huge government which creates problems for the business community rather than solves problems for the business community. So that has to be, the government has to reduce. Tariq Hamid Saab, human capital, I agree with you. I mean, we have not been able to develop human capital. I hire hundreds of people a year, and it's so sad for me that people with degrees and all that, I mean, it's just a degree and not much brain development, not much creativity in them. And the brains are leaving this country and they seldom come back because they do not have good enough jobs meant for them. So we really have to do a lot on that. Judicial system, I don't want to say much on that, except that we suffer because of that every day. They are great judges, they are honorable judges, but the system as a whole, the lower courts and all that needs major reforms. Oil and gas, why can't we import that from Iran? Because we spent a lot of time and we wasted a lot of time. I hope we are able to use that. The gas pipeline between Iran and us, but we were hit with sanctions. Iran was hit with sanctions. We did not get enough investment, so that is at a standstill. Importing through the Central Asian Republic countries, Turkmenistan, and that, we spent a lot of time on that, but I don't think that we can see that in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harun Akhtar Saab. That was brilliant, very sequential and very to the point. Thank you, sir. Tim Jones.
I think the only thing I have something to add on is the question about debt to GDP. Debt to GDP is not a good guide to a government's debt situation, as it takes no account of the interest rate on the debt, the amount of revenue that a government is collecting out of GDP, who the debt is owed to, how long it's owed over, and the currency of the debt. So to take the Japan example, their interest rates are very low. Most of the debt is owed to people in Japan or even to the Japan's own central bank. It's owed in the Japanese currency and it's owed over long periods of time. So debt to GDP does not give an insight into a country's debt situation. It's much better to look at other indicators like the external debt payments as a proportion of government revenue. And yeah, on those measures, then Pakistan has one of the highest ratios in the world, as has just been said, possibly the highest if it was, does go as high as 85% this year. And in that context, it needs to be questioned whether the assumption that debt must always be paid is true, and actually there are mechanisms out there and ways of approaching that don't assume that debt must always be paid. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your great presentation. Before I go to Humayun Saab for closing the meeting, I just want to recognize some very eminent people who are in the audience, but of course haven't asked or made a comment. Dr. Akram Sheikh Saab, Ahmed Bakar, former Finance Secretary. Akram Sheikh Saab is Deputy Chairman Planning Commission, and a host of others, Ansar Shamsi, senior officers of finance and planning. Humayun Akhtar Saab, I request you to close the meeting, sir.
Thank you. Okay, so let me first start what I have picked from this round today. I think we should immediately start with resolving our balance of payment problem. And I think Mr. Tim Jones has given us some good insights. The G20 common framework, where at least the bilateral and private debt, although unfortunately not MFI debt, but hopefully they'll fall in line too. And also the IMF policies on debt. So, I mean, I know that our institute has been thinking, particularly lately, that just going for the 7th review or perhaps a new program, we very definitely have to accompany that with debt restructuring. And I'll add to it, which we have not spoken that much, and I wish I could ask Dr. Pasha, is the internal debt restructuring, because we have all these banks of Pakistan which are accumulating a lot of government securities on their balance sheets, knowing quite well that the servicing for which takes place through more debt. And as of today, I don't think that debt existing on the books of Pakistan banks will ever be realized. So why don't we sit and do something about it? So I would also add, in addition to what Tim Jones has suggested, some internal debt restructuring. Now, let's get out of the situation which has been discussed, that this economy, the moment it goes beyond 3%, or the moment there is a commodity crisis in the world, and there are the double whammy today, we get, and as Harun has pointed out, that last time it took a number of years, this time it took a number of months to enter into a new crisis. So you got to do something about that. And the only thing is, I think of all the debt we have accumulated in the last at least 20 years, close to 40% has been used for development. The rest has gone meeting our current expenditure. Can we try and get out of that? I mean, control our expenditure. Don't use our debt to cover our expenditure, and also use our debt, particularly if the nomination is foreign, in projects which create foreign exchange. And so that leads us to two things. Import substitution. There was a question raised that import substitution, we got our 1960s growth and all the Asian economy. Yeah, but import substitution cannot remain import substitution forever. Import substitution in all the growth countries was eventually replaced by a major surge in exports. And therefore, yes, we should start with import substitution to cut our import bills and incentivize. And we must incentivize our export sector, but not perpetually. There should be sunset clauses where they should be linked to the growth in exports. They should be linked to the productivity increases. They should be linked to the technology content in our exports. And that has been the reason why we have been left behind, where the exports are not even elastic to devaluations. The FTAs, I'm the culprit who signed the first FTA with China, the FTA1 back in 2007. And our objective was that let's import a lot of machinery and raw material from China. And we gave in very little. But I don't know what has happened in the meantime. A lot of other countries also got this same FTA, particularly Asian countries with China, and we were left behind. And there was, considering the experience in FTA1, I don't think we should have gone into FTA2, whereas Harun and Dr. Pasha have said that there are problems there, and that's one of the reasons why we constantly are getting a balance of payment problem. These are some of the things which need to be done immediately. Now, you spoke of the Musharraf era, Zagam Rizvi Saab. I mean, Tariq was with me heading the Export Promotion Bureau and very ably work. We made good use of the elimination of textile quotas. I think we moved very well. We enabled a lot of machinery to be imported. One mistake we made, very definitely, I admit that's not our responsibility, it was finance, where we have this tendency to keep the rupee overvalued. The rupee should just be at the real effective exchange rate. It should not be based on cash flows of the foreign currency. They're very temporary. And I think we kept the rupee overvalued, which almost every finance minister in recent times, they think that that somehow is an indication of a strong economy, which is not, because the first problem in the world, and we run into very serious problems. So look, let's start with restructuring. Let's start with controlling our current expenditure, not using our debt. Yeah, let's start using our debt into areas from where we can pay if it's a foreign debt. And I totally agree. I honestly feel that the future actually lies, of course, we are an agriculture country, and that's become self-sufficient in all those edible products and energy products which we are importing. But really, the future of this country basically lies with enhancing the manufacturing sector, and that the private sector of Pakistan is quite capable of doing. If we keep bringing schemes which first diverted all the money to the IPPs, I mean, most of the industrial money went to IPPs. I mean, just look at the number of projects where the traditional industrialists went to IPPs. And then a lot of money started going to the stock market, and then money started going to the real estate market because there were huge incentives available there. And that's the money that should have been invested in the manufacturing sector. So these are some of the observations I wanted to make, and I gained a lot from this interaction, and I'm very sorry if we took more time. And as always, I'm greatly appreciative of the very honorable speakers, Mr. Hafiz Pasha, Mr. Tim Jones, and Mr. Haroon Khan, and of course our very illustrious participants in participating in still another IPR. I mean, I hope that we were able to come up with some solutions for this country's economy. Thank you very much, everybody.
Before we end the meeting, I want to recognize our staff who worked a great deal to make this happen. There are people silently working behind the scenes to make this happen and run it efficiently, and we were able to do so. Thank you all. Let's end the meeting. Bye.